talk to you, try to educate you a little bit about Marvel Comics today, and a little bit of history. Originally, the company was founded in 1939 by Martin Goodman, and back then it was called Timely Publications. At first, superheroes were a pretty popular genre back then. It was after the Great Depression and during World War II. We needed somebody to kick the Nazis' butt, so we had superheroes for a while. After that, kind of when we used it in the 40s, superheroes kind of fell out of style, and comic books went back to their original genres, which were things like romance and western and horror and crime, mystery, and stuff. Superheroes really kind of fell to the wayside, even with Marvel Comics, Timely Publications at the time. In the 40s, they tried to introduce a couple female superheroes that really didn't do so well, like Sun Girl and Venus. If anybody's ever heard of them, perhaps you, because I hadn't. In 1951, they started to be known as Atlas Comics. They changed their name. And then in 1955, the Comics Code Authority was formed, or the CCA, which is an evil organization that censors comic books. And this led to a ban on a lot of horror comics, which was something that was keeping a lot of companies at the time alive. So a lot went under, which meant competition lessened for Atlas Comics. So it was kind of good. They kind of scraped by just toning down their content accordingly. But still, comic books back then in the 50s were the video games of today. Something's always corrupting the youth. In the late 50s, they almost went under altogether, but thanks mostly to editor Stan Lieber, better known as Stan Lee, they were kept alive. He was able to create a really close, tight-knit group of artists and writers. So he could really, for the first time, do what he wanted. And some of the names of this group, maybe heard of: Jack Kirby, Steve Ditko, and Stan Lee's younger brother, Larry Lieber. By the 60s, thanks in part to DC Comic, who was coming out with the Justice League at the time, superheroes became a lot more popular all of a sudden. And so Martin Goodman approached Stan Lee and said, we got to do something like this that they're doing, like the Justice League. And so that's when he came up with the Fantastic Four. The Fantastic Four was a pretty, revolutionary superhero group as far as superhero groups went. They didn't really fit any of the norms. The leading lady and the leading man were already in love at the beginning of the series, so there was no tension there. And they didn't hide any of their identities. They didn't have secret identities. Some of them were ugly, not the classic superhero good looks. And this was the first comic book that got published under the name Marvel Comics, which they came to be known as. So Fantastic Four was a pretty huge hit. And in the 60s, they followed the success with quite a few superheroes. Most of the superheroes we know today were created in the 60s, like the Incredible Hulk, for instance, which some little known facts about the Hulk is that he wasn't originally green. He was gray, but due to inconsistency and printing errors, gray never turned out the same tone. So Stan Lee said, just make him any color. And that's how we have Gatorade Green Hulk, although he wasn't nearly that adorable. And then they came up with Spider-Man, which was a really popular character because he was kind of an everyman. He was a dorky, awkward teenage boy, which most comic book audience could relate to. People like that. Other superheroes created in the 60s were Iron Man, the X-Men, Daredevil, Black Panther, and Captain America made a return when he was canceled in the early 40s. And at this point, superheroes completely took over, and the old genres of horror and romance and westerns were few and far between. And by 1968, Marvel was dominating the comic book world. In the 70s, their success kind of started to go on a little bit of a decline. They had to cancel X-Men in the early 70s because of poor sales, which is kind of unbelievable to think about today, how successful it's been since. During the 70s, comics kind of got a little bit darker. Characters started dying off, and people had mixed feelings about that. More mature storylines. And then in 1974, they created one of their most popular characters of all time, Wolverine. And he was just completely different than a superhero. He was originally created as a cameo for a issue of Incredible Hulk. They liked him so much he stuck, I guess. He was created by several people. He was this short, hairy, middle-aged brute, which was totally different from the wax-chested, clean-shaven crime fighters that kids were used to. And then by the next year, 1975, he was added to the X-Men, which was revived and has been successful ever since. Later on in the 70s, their success kind of started to go over to the big screen. They made 2 movies centering around the Incredible Hulk, which turned into the weekly TV series with Bill Bixby and I don't know if anybody has seen that or remembers that. I wasn't born yet, but in the 80s, later on in the 80s, they started to become popular. They signed with Hasbro Industries with toys, so a lot of action figures started being made. They had their own animated television series, a lot of them, Fantastic Four and X-Men. Then, once we got into the 90s, storylines started to get even darker, and anti-heroes became more popular than the do-gooding heroes. People died a lot more. New villains were introduced, more serious villains, not some of the hokier ones. And
30 seconds.
Crossovers were also really prevalent in the 90s. And even Marvel and DC collaborated to do some stuff. And and then when the Millennium hit, we all remember that came out with 1001 Marvel superhero movies, X-Men, Spider-Man, Daredevil, Punisher, Fantastic Four, Iron Man, Incredible Hulk. Probably all seen them. And that's about it. I hope you all know that you are now that much nerdier than you were this morning.